The morning sun was already burning hot when Mary stepped out of her small wooden cabin for what she knew would be the last time. Her hands shook as she pulled the heavy wooden door shut behind her, the sound echoing across the empty farmland that had once been her home. 7 months pregnant and completely alone, she stood there for a moment, one hand resting on her swollen belly as she looked at the life she was leaving behind. The farm had been everything to her. And her husband, just 2 years ago, they had worked from sunrise to sunset, planting crops, tending to their small garden, and dreaming of the day when their children would run through these same fields. But those dreams had crumbled like dust in her hands when her husband packed his bags 3 months ago, muttering about gold in California and how a man needed to chase his fortune before it was too late. Mary had begged him to stay, especially with the baby coming, but his mind was made up. He left her with nothing but a broken-down wagon, a few personal belongings, and promises to send money that never came. The bank had taken the farm last week, and now she had nowhere to go except the town of Millbrook, 15 miles away, where she hoped to find work and a place to live before her baby arrived. She walked over to the old wagon that sat beside the cabin, its wooden wheels worn smooth from years of use. The wagon had seen better days. Paint was peeling off its sides, and one of the wheels made a terrible squeaking sound whenever it turned. But it was all she had to carry her few possessions to town. She had loaded it the night before with everything she could fit: a small trunk with her clothes, a rocking chair that had belonged to her mother, some pots and pans, a bag of flour, and a few precious books that she couldn't bear to leave behind. The wagon was heavy, much heavier than she had expected as she grabbed the wooden handles and tried to pull it forward. The weight nearly knocked her off balance. She had to stop and catch her breath, her hand automatically going to her belly where the baby was kicking, as if sensing her distress. Taking a deep breath, she tried again, this time putting all her strength into it. The wagon moved slowly, inch by inch, the squeaky wheel protesting with every turn. The dirt road to town stretched out before her like a long, dusty ribbon under the Texas sun. She had walked this road many times before, but never while pulling a heavy wagon and carrying a baby. Every step was a struggle. Her back ached from the weight of the wagon and the baby, and her feet, swollen from pregnancy, felt like they were on fire in her worn-out boots. After just half a mile, she had to stop again. Sweat was pouring down her face, and her dress was already damp with perspiration. She sat down on a large rock beside the road, trying to catch her breath and figure out how she was going to make it the rest of the way to town. The baby was moving a lot today, pressing against her ribs and making it hard to breathe. She rubbed her belly gently, talking to the little one inside. "I know this is hard, little one," she whispered, "but we're going to make it. We have to make it. Mama's going to find us a good home in town, and you're going to be born safe and sound." She stood up again and grabbed the wagon handles, determined to keep going. The sun was getting higher in the sky, and she wanted to reach town before the afternoon heat became unbearable. Each step was painful, but she kept moving forward, one foot in front of the other. The road seemed to stretch on forever, and she began to wonder if she had made a mistake trying to do this alone. As she walked, she thought about her life and how everything had changed so quickly. Just a year ago, she had been happy and hopeful, planning for her future with her husband and dreaming about their first child. She had been a school teacher before getting married, and she loved working with children. She had hoped to teach her own children someday, to read to them from the same books she was now carrying in her wagon, but life had other plans. Her husband had become restless and distant, talking constantly about men who were getting rich in the California gold fields. He would spend hours reading newspaper stories about miners striking it rich and coming home with bags full of gold. Mary had tried to convince him that they had everything they needed right here, but he couldn't see it. To him, the farm was just a reminder of what he didn't have, not a celebration of what he did have. The morning he left, Mary had watched from the window as he loaded his horse with supplies and saddled up to ride west. He had come back to the house one last time, kissed her forehead, and promised he would send for her as soon as he struck it rich. That was 3 months ago, and she hadn't heard a word from him since. now as she struggled to pull the wagon along. The dusty road, Mary felt the full weight of her situation. She was completely alone in the world, with no family to turn to and no money to her name. Her parents had died when she was young, and she had no brothers or sisters. Her husband's family had never approved of their marriage, and she knew they wouldn't welcome her back now. The town of Millbrook was her only hope. It was a small but growing community with a main street lined with shops and businesses. She had heard there was a boarding house where she might be able to get a room, and she hoped to find work as a seamstress or maybe even as a cook. She was good with her hands and had always been able to make do with very little as the hours passed. The sun climbed higher in the sky and the heat became almost unbearable. Mary had to stop more and more frequently, sometimes sitting down, right there in the dirt road to rest. Her water bottle was nearly empty, and she was starting to feel dizzy from the heat and exhaustion. The baby seemed to be getting more active, and she wondered if all this stress was affecting the little one. She looked ahead at the long road, still stretching before her, and felt a wave of despair wash over her. How was she ever going to make it to town? And even if she did, what kind of life could she provide for her baby? She had less than $5 to her name, and winter was coming soon. Would she and her baby end up on the streets, begging for food and shelter? These dark thoughts swirled in her mind as she forced herself to stand up and grab the wagon handles once more. She couldn't give up now. She had come too far to turn back, and there was nothing for her back at the farm anyway. All she could do was keep putting one foot in front of the other and hope that somehow, someway, everything would work out. As she struggled forward, pulling the heavy wagon behind her, Mary didn't know that her life was about to change in ways she could never have imagined. She didn't know that just a few miles ahead, a chance encounter would transform her from a desperate woman with no hope into someone who would find love, security, and happiness beyond her wildest dreams. All she knew was that she had to keep moving forward, for her sake and for the sake of the precious life growing inside her. Mary's legs felt like they were about to give out completely when she heard the sound of horse hooves behind her on the dusty road. She had been walking for what felt like hours, and the sun was now directly overhead, beating down on her with a heat that made every breath feel like fire in her lungs. Her dress was soaked with sweat, and she could feel the baby moving restlessly inside her, as if the little one was just as uncomfortable as she was. The sound of the approaching horse made her nervous. Out here on the lonely road between her old farm and town, she was completely vulnerable. She had heard stories of women being robbed or worse when they traveled alone, and in her condition she couldn't run or defend herself if trouble came her way. She kept her head down and continued pulling the wagon, hoping whoever was behind her would just ride past without paying her any attention. But the horse slowed down as it got closer, and she could hear the rider pulling up alongside her. Mary's heart started beating faster, and she gripped the wagon handles tighter, ready to abandon everything and run into the fields if she had to. She glanced sideways and saw expensive leather boots in the stirrups of a beautiful brown horse. This wasn't some drifter or troublemaker. The boots alone probably cost more than she had made in a month when she was still teaching school. "Ma'am, excuse me," came a deep, gentle voice from above. Mary looked up and saw a man in his 30s sitting tall in the saddle. He was wearing a clean white shirt, a black vest, and a hat that looked like it had never seen a day of hard work. His face was kind, with concerned brown eyes that seemed to take in her situation at a glance. But what struck her most was that he had taken off his hat when he spoke to her, showing the kind of respect that she hadn't experienced in a long time. "I'm sorry to bother you," he continued, his voice soft and respectful, "but I couldn't help but notice you struggling with that wagon. Are you all right?" Mary stopped walking and stood there for a moment, catching her breath. She wanted to say she was fine, that she didn't need help from anyone, but the words wouldn't come. She was exhausted, scared, and completely overwhelmed. The kindness in this stranger's voice was almost too much to bear after the months of hardship she had endured. I'm managing," she finally said, though her voice shook with fatigue. She wiped the sweat from her forehead with the back of her hand and tried to stand up straighter. Not wanting to appear weak in front of this well-dressed stranger, the man looked at her with genuine concern, then at the heavy wagon she was pulling, and then back at her obviously pregnant condition. He dismounted from his horse in one smooth motion, and Mary took a step back, still not sure if she could trust this situation. "My name is Robert," he said, holding his hat in his hands. "Robert Wellington. I own the Double W Ranch about 5 miles from here. I was just coming back from a business meeting in the next county when I saw you on the road." He paused, seeming to choose his words carefully. "Ma'am, I don't mean to be forward, but you look like you could use some help. That wagon's got to be heavy, and this heat is something fierce today." Mary studied his face, looking for any sign of bad intentions. But all she saw was honest concern and a genuine desire to help. Still, she had learned to be cautious. "I appreciate the offer, Mr. Wellington, but I can handle it myself. I'm just heading to town." Robert nodded respectfully. "I understand your caution, ma'am. You don't know me from Adam, and a woman has to be careful these days. But I grew up with a mother and 3 sisters, and I was raised to never let a lady struggle when I could lend a hand. Would it be all right if I at least helped you get this wagon to town? I promise I'm not looking for anything in return except the peace of mind of knowing you made it there safely." Something in his tone convinced Mary that he was sincere. Maybe it was the way he mentioned his mother and sisters, or maybe it was just that she was too tired to argue anymore. Whatever it was, she found herself nodding slowly. "I suppose that would be helpful," she said quietly, "but I don't want to put you to any trouble." Robert smiled for the first time, and Mary noticed that his whole face seemed to light up when he did. "No trouble at all, ma'am. It would be my pleasure." He walked over to the wagon and examined the handles. "This thing's seen some years, hasn't it? But it's solidly built. My grandfather had one just like it when I was a boy." As Robert took hold of the wagon handles, Mary noticed how easily he lifted them, making the heavy load look like it weighed nothing at all. She had been struggling with it for hours, and he made it look effortless. They began walking together toward town, and for the first time all day, Mary felt like she could breathe properly. "If you don't mind me asking," Robert said as they walked, "what brings you to town? Are you visiting family there?" Mary hesitated. She didn't want to tell this stranger her whole sad story, but she also didn't want to lie. I'm moving to town," she said finally. "My husband is ... away, and I need to find work before the baby comes." Robert nodded without asking any more questions, and Mary was grateful for his discretion. As they walked, he told her about his ranch, how his father had started it 30 years ago with just a small herd of cattle and a dream. Now it was one of the biggest ranches in the county, with hundreds of head of cattle and dozens of ranch hands. "Do you have family of your own?" Mary asked, curious about this kind stranger who had stopped to help her. "No, ma'am," Robert said with a slightly sad smile. "Never found the right woman, I suppose? Been too busy helping my father build the ranch. But he's been telling me lately that it's time I thought about settling down, starting a family of my own." He glanced at her belly. "When is your little one due?" "About 2 months," Mary said, unconsciously placing her hand on her stomach. "Maybe a little less?" "That's exciting," Robert said warmly. "There's nothing quite like a new baby to bring joy into the world. Are you hoping for a boy or a girl?" "I don't really care," Mary said honestly. "I just want the baby to be healthy and safe." She paused, then added quietly, "I want to be able to provide a good home." Robert heard the worry in her voice and glanced at her with understanding. "I'm sure you'll be a wonderful mother," he said gently. "Anyone can see that you're willing to do whatever it takes to take care of your child. That's the most important thing." As they got closer to town, Mary began to feel nervous about what came next. She had a little money, but not much, and she had no idea where she would stay or how she would find work. The town of Millbrook was growing, but it was still small enough that everyone knew everyone else's business. A pregnant woman arriving alone would certainly cause talk. "Ma'am," Robert said quietly as they approached the outskirts of town, "I hope you don't think I'm being too forward, but do you have a place to stay tonight?" Mary felt her cheeks redden. I'm planning to inquire at the boarding house." She said, double quotes, Mrs. Patterson runs a clean, respectable place, Robert said. She's a good woman and she'd treat you fairly. If you'd like, I could introduce you to her, make sure you get settled in properly. Mary looked at this man who had appeared out of nowhere to help her, and she felt something she hadn't felt in months. Hope. Maybe, just maybe, things were going to work out after all. That would be very kind of you, Mr. Wellington, she said softly. I don't know how to thank you. No, thanks necessary, Robert replied. Just glad I could help a neighbor in need. As they walked into town together, neither of them realized that this chance meeting on a dusty road would change both of their lives forever. The boarding house that Mrs. Patterson ran was a 2-story white building with a wide front porch and rocking chairs lined up in a neat row. When Robert introduced Mary to the older woman, Mrs. Patterson's sharp eyes took in Mary's condition. Immediately, but her expression remained kind and welcoming. Robert quietly spoke with her for a few minutes, and Mary noticed him reaching into his vest pocket, though she couldn't see what passed between them. You'll be comfortable here, dear, Mrs. Patterson said warmly, leading Mary to a small but clean room on the second floor. I've got a nice room with a view of the garden, and the morning sun comes in just right. You'll need your rest with a little one coming soon. Mary wanted to ask about the cost, but something in Mrs. Patterson's manner suggested that Robert had already taken care of those details. The thought made her both grateful and uncomfortable. She wasn't used to accepting charity, and she didn't want to be beholden to anyone, especially a man she had just met. That evening, as Mary sat on the front porch of the boarding house, she watched the people of Millbrook going about their daily business. Children played in the dusty street while their mothers called them in for supper. Shop owners were closing up for the day, and working men were heading home to their families. It was a peaceful scene, but Mary felt like an outsider looking in. She was surprised when Robert appeared at the bottom of the porch steps, holding a small basket in his hands. He had changed out of his fancy clothes and was now wearing simple work pants and a cotton shirt, looking more like a regular ranch hand than the wealthy landowner she knew him to be. I hope you don't mind me stopping by, he said, climbing the steps slowly. I brought you some things from the ranch. My cook, Mrs. Rodriguez, insisted on sending over some fresh bread and vegetables from our garden. Mary accepted the basket gratefully, touched by the thoughtfulness. Inside she found warm bread that smelled like heaven, fresh tomatoes, green beans, and even some eggs carefully packed in straw. There was also a small jar of honey and some butter wrapped in cloth. This is too much, Mary said, though her stomach was already rumbling at the smell of the fresh bread. You've already done so much for me. It's nothing, Robert said, settling into the rocking chair next to hers. Mrs. Rodriguez loves to cook, and she always makes too much food. She was actually excited to have someone new to fuss over. As they sat together on the porch, watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of orange and pink, Mary found herself relaxing for the first time in months. Robert had an easy way about him that made her feel comfortable, and he seemed genuinely interested in what she had to say. Tell me about your teaching, he said after they had sat in comfortable silence for a while. Mrs. Patterson mentioned. You used to be a school teacher. Mary's face brightened as she talked about her former profession. She told him about the little schoolhouse where she had taught, how she had loved working with the children and watching them discover new things. She talked about her favorite students and the books she had read to them, her voice growing more animated as she spoke. I always dreamed of having a whole library of books, she said wistfully. I wanted to give children access to stories and knowledge that would open up the world for them. There's something magical about watching a child's face light up when they understand something new. Robert listened intently, asking thoughtful questions about her teaching methods and her favorite books. Mary was surprised by how much he seemed to understand about education and learning. I never had much formal schooling myself, he admitted. My father believed in learning by doing, so I was working on the ranch from the time I could sit on a horse. But I've always regretted not having more book learning. I try to read when I can, but it's not the same as having a real education. Intelligence isn't just about books, Mary said gently. You can tell a lot about a person by how they treat others, how they solve problems, how they see the world. You have a kind heart and a sharp mind. That's worth more than any number of books. Robert smiled at her words, and Mary felt a warmth spread through her chest that had nothing to do with the evening air. Over the next few days, Robert began stopping by the boarding house regularly. Sometimes he brought food from the ranch, sometimes he just came to sit and talk. Mary found herself looking forward to these visits more than she wanted to admit. She told herself it was just because she was lonely and he was the only person in town who had shown her real kindness, but the truth was, she was starting to develop feelings for this gentle man who had appeared in her life when she needed help. Most. She loved the way he listened to her stories about teaching, how he asked her opinion on things, and how he never made her feel like she was just a burden to be pitied. One afternoon, Robert arrived at the boarding house carrying a small wooden crate. "I have something for you," he said, his eyes twinkling with excitement. "I remembered what you said about wanting a library of books." Mary opened the crate and gasped. Inside were dozens of books, some new and some well-worn, but all carefully chosen. There were novels, poetry collections, books about history and science, and even some children's books. "Robert, I can't accept this," Mary said, though her hands were already reaching for the books. "This is too much." "My mother collected books her whole life," Robert explained. "After she passed away 5 years ago, they've just been sitting in boxes in the attic. She would have loved knowing they were going to someone who would appreciate them and use them to teach children." Mary picked up a volume of poetry and opened it carefully. On the inside cover, written in careful handwriting, were the words, "Property of Catherine Wellington." She looked up at Robert with tears in her eyes. "Your mother's books?" she whispered. "Are you sure you want to part with them?" "I can't think of anyone who would treasure them more," Robert said softly. "Besides, they're meant to be read, not locked away in an attic." As Mary carefully examined each book, Robert watched her with a strange expression on his face. There was something tender in his eyes, something that made Mary's heart skip a beat. She realized that what was happening between them was more than just kindness from a good Samaritan. Robert was looking at her the way a man looks at a woman he cares about. The realization both thrilled and terrified her. She was a married woman, even if her husband had abandoned her. She was pregnant with another man's child. What could a successful, wealthy man like Robert possibly see in someone like her? One evening, as they sat on the porch reading together, Mary felt the baby kick particularly hard. She winced and placed her hand on her stomach, and Robert immediately noticed her discomfort. "Are you all right?" he asked, setting down his book. "The baby's just very active tonight," Mary said with a small smile. "I think the little one is going to be a handful. May I?" Robert asked quietly, gesturing toward her belly. Mary hesitated for a moment, then nodded. Robert placed his hand gently on her stomach, and almost immediately the baby kicked again. Robert's face lit up with wonder and joy. "Hello there, little one," he said softly to Mary's belly. "You're strong, aren't you? Just like your mama?" In that moment, Mary felt something shift inside her heart. This man, this wonderful, kind man, was talking to her unborn child as if it were already part of his world. She had never expected to find love again, especially not in her current circumstances. But sitting there on the porch with Robert's hand on her stomach and his voice gentle in the evening air, she realized that love had found her anyway. As the weeks passed and Mary's belly grew larger, she found herself thinking more and more about Robert and what his kindness meant. She would catch herself watching the road from her window, waiting for his daily visits. When he didn't come, one day because of ranch business, she felt genuinely disappointed and worried that something had happened to him, but Robert was struggling with his own thoughts and feelings. Every night he would lie awake in his bed at the ranch, staring at the ceiling and thinking about Mary. He had never felt this way about anyone before, and the intensity of his feelings scared him. He was falling in love with a woman who was married to another man, a woman who was carrying another man's child. What kind of future could they possibly have together? The problem was, he couldn't stop himself from caring about her. Every time He saw her face light up when she talked about teaching, every time she laughed at something he said. Every time she placed her hand protectively on her belly, he fell a little deeper in love. He found himself making excuses to come to town more often, bringing her little gifts and staying longer each time. Mary wasn't the only one who noticed Robert's frequent visits. Mrs. Patterson, who had been running the boarding house for 20 years, had seen enough of life to recognize love when she saw it. She watched the way Robert's face changed when he looked at Mary, and she saw how Mary's whole demeanor brightened whenever he arrived. "That young man is smitten with you, Mrs. Patterson told Mary one morning as they sat in the kitchen having breakfast. "And if you ask me, the feeling is mutual." Mary felt her cheeks burn with embarrassment. "I don't know what you mean," she said, though she couldn't meet Mrs. Patterson's knowing eyes. "Honey, I've been watching people fall in love for more years than I care to count," Mrs. Patterson said gently. "That man brings you gifts, spends every free moment he has sitting on this porch with you, and looks at you like you hung the moon. And you light up like a Christmas tree every time you hear his horse coming down the street." Mary sighed and placed her hands on her belly. "Even if what you're saying is true, what difference does it make? I'm married to another man, and I'm carrying his child. What kind of life could I offer someone like Robert?" "Sometimes life doesn't go according to plan," Mrs. Patterson said wisely. "Sometimes the best things come when we least expect them, and sometimes we have to be brave enough to reach for happiness when it's offered to us." That same day, Robert was having a very different conversation with his father at the ranch. The older man had been watching his son's behavior with growing concern and had finally decided to speak up. "Son, I need to talk to you about this woman you've been spending time with," Robert's father said as they sat on the porch of the ranch house after dinner. Robert tensed up immediately. "What about her, Pa?" "People in town are talking," his father said carefully. "They're saying you're getting too involved with a married woman who's carrying another man's child. They're saying it doesn't look right for a Wellington to be seen with someone like that." Robert felt anger rise in his chest. "Someone like what?" "Mary's one of the finest people I've ever met. She's intelligent, kind, and she's been abandoned by her husband. She's trying to make a life for herself and her child, and there's nothing wrong with helping her." "I'm not saying there's anything wrong with helping," his father said. "But this looks like more than just helping, Robert. And people are starting to wonder what your intentions are." "My intentions are to marry her," Robert said quietly, surprising himself with his own boldness. His father stared at him in shock. "Son, you can't be serious. You're talking about marrying a woman who's already married, who's carrying another man's child. What will people think? What will happen to our family's reputation?" "I don't care what people think," Robert said, standing up and walking to the edge of the porch. "I love her, Pa. I love her more than I've ever loved anyone. And that baby she's carrying, I already love that child too. I want to be a father to that baby, and I want to be Mary's husband." His father was quiet for a long moment, studying his son's face. Finally he spoke. "You're really serious about this, aren't you?" "I've never been more serious about anything in my life," Robert said. "Then I think it's time I met this woman properly," his father said with a sigh. "If she's going to be part of this family, I need to know what kind of person she is." The next day, Robert arrived at the boarding house looking nervous and formal in his best suit. Mary was sitting on the porch reading one of the books from his mother's collection when he approached. "Mary, I'd like you to meet my father," Robert said. Gesturing to the older man beside him, Mary stood up carefully, smoothing down her dress and trying to look presentable despite her advanced pregnancy. Robert's father was a tall, distinguished man with gray hair and sharp eyes that seemed to take in everything at once. "It's a pleasure to meet you, Mr. Wellington," Mary said, offering her hand. "The pleasure is mine, ma'am," Robert's father said, taking her hand gently. "I've heard quite a lot about you." They sat together on the porch, and Mary found herself being questioned about her background, her education, her plans for the future. But the questions weren't harsh or judgmental. Robert's father seemed genuinely interested in getting to know her as a person. When Mary mentioned her teaching experience, his eyes lit up with interest. We've been talking about starting a school on the ranch for the children of our workers, he said. Most of them can't read or write, and we think it would be good for them to have some education. I would love to help with something like that, Mary said enthusiastically. Every child deserves the chance to learn. As the conversation continued, Robert watched his father's expression change from skepticism to genuine interest, and finally to something that looked like approval. By the time they left, his father was treating Mary with the same respect he would show any lady of good standing. That evening, as Robert walked Mary around the small garden behind the boarding house, he finally found the courage to say what had been in his heart for weeks. "Mary, I need to tell you something," he said. Stopping beside a rose bush that was blooming despite the late season, Mary looked up at him, her heart starting to beat faster. Something in his tone told her that this was the moment she had been both hoping for and dreading. "I know this might sound crazy," Robert continued, taking her hands in his. "I know your situation is complicated, and I know we haven't known each other very long. But I've fallen in love with you, Mary, not just because I feel sorry for you, not because I think you need rescuing, but because you're the most amazing woman I've ever met." Mary felt tears spring to her eyes. "Robert, please, let me finish," he said gently. "I love your mind, your spirit, your strength. I love the way you care about other people, especially children. I love that you never gave up even when everything seemed hopeless. And I love that baby you're carrying, even though it's not mine. I want to be a father to that child, and I want to be your husband." Mary was crying now, overwhelmed by the depth of his feelings and by her own emotions. "I love you too," she whispered. "I didn't think it was possible, but I do. I love you so much it scares me." "Then marry me," Robert said, his voice shaking with emotion. "I know it's complicated, I know there will be challenges, but I don't care. I want to spend the rest of my life with you and that baby." Mary looked into his eyes and saw nothing but love and sincerity. For the first time in months, she allowed herself to believe that happiness was possible. "Yes," she said through her tears, "yes, I'll marry you." As Robert pulled her into his arms, Mary felt like she was finally home. The news of Mary's engagement to Robert spread through the small town of Millbrook like wildfire. Some people whispered behind closed doors about the wealthy rancher marrying a pregnant woman whose husband had abandoned her. But most of the townspeople, especially those who had gotten to know Mary during her time at the boarding house, were genuinely happy for the couple. Mrs. Patterson was over the moon with excitement. "I knew it from the first day I saw you two together," she told Mary as they sat in the boarding house parlor, planning the simple wedding ceremony. "That man was already in love with you before he even knew it himself." Mary's pregnancy was getting close to the end, and they decided to have a small, quiet wedding ceremony as soon as possible. Robert wanted to make sure they were married before the baby arrived, so the child would be born into a secure, loving family. The wedding took place on a crisp October morning in the little church at the center of town. Mary wore a simple blue dress that Mrs. Patterson had helped her alter to fit over her pregnant belly. She carried a small bouquet of wildflowers that Robert had picked from the fields around his ranch. Despite the circumstances, or maybe because of them, Mary had never felt more beautiful or more loved. Robert stood at the altar wearing his best suit, his face glowing with happiness and nervous excitement. When Mary walked down the aisle, he felt like his heart might burst with joy. She was radiant, and he couldn't believe that this amazing woman had agreed to become his wife. The ceremony was attended by about 30 people, including Robert's father, Mrs. Patterson, several townspeople who had become fond of Mary, and some of the ranch hands from Robert's property. As they exchanged vows, promising to love and cherish each other in good times and bad, there wasn't a dry eye in the church. When the preacher pronounced them husband and wife, Robert kissed Mary gently, his hand resting protectively on her belly where their soon-to-be-born child was growing. It was a moment of pure happiness that both of them would remember for the rest of their lives. After the wedding, they moved to the Wellington Ranch, where Robert had prepared a special suite of rooms for Mary. He had spent weeks making sure everything was perfect, with comfortable furniture, plenty of books, and a beautiful nursery for the baby. Mary was overwhelmed by his thoughtfulness and attention to detail. "I want you to feel like this is your home," Robert told her as he showed her around the house. "Not just a place you're staying, but your real home where you belong." Mary felt tears in her eyes as she looked around at the beautiful rooms Robert had prepared for her. After months of uncertainty and fear, she finally had a real home again, with a man who loved her and wanted to build a life with her. The ranch was bigger than anything Mary had ever experienced. There were dozens of workers, hundreds of cattle, and thousands of acres of land stretching as far as the eye could see. But what impressed her most was how Robert treated everyone who worked for him. He knew all their names, asked about their families, and made sure they were paid fairly and treated with respect. One of Mary's favorite people on the ranch was Mrs. Rodriguez, the cook who had been sending her food during her time at the boarding house. The older woman immediately took Mary under her wing, teaching her about running a large household and sharing stories about Robert's childhood. "That boy has been waiting his whole life for someone like you," Mrs. Rodriguez told Mary one afternoon as they worked together in the kitchen. "His father was always after him to get married, but Robert said he was waiting for the right woman. I guess he found her." Just 3 weeks after the wedding, Mary went into labor. It was a long, difficult birth, but Robert never left her side. He held her hand, wiped her forehead with cool cloths, and whispered words of encouragement when the pain became almost unbearable. When the baby finally arrived, a healthy little girl with dark hair and bright eyes, Robert was the first person, besides the midwife, to hold her. Mary watched through exhausted tears as her new husband cradled the tiny infant, speaking to her in soft, gentle tones. "Hello, little one," Robert whispered to the baby. "I'm your papa, and I'm going to love you and take care of you for the rest of your life." They named the baby Grace, and from the moment she was born, Robert treated her as if she were his own biological child. He got up with her during the night, changed her diapers, and spent hours just sitting and talking to her while Mary rested. As Grace grew from a baby into a toddler, the bond between her and Robert only grew stronger. She called him Papa from the time she could talk, and he was completely devoted to her. People who didn't know their story would never have guessed that Grace wasn't Robert's biological daughter. Mary found her calling on the ranch in ways she had never expected. She started teaching the children of the ranch workers, just as Robert's father had mentioned during their first meeting. What began as informal lessons in the ranch house kitchen grew into a proper school in a building that Robert had constructed specifically for that purpose. The school became Mary's pride and joy. She taught children of all ages, from little ones just learning their letters to teenagers who were eager to learn about the world beyond the ranch. Many of the adult workers also came to her evening classes, wanting to learn to read and write so they could better provide for their families. "You've given these people something more valuable than money," Robert told Mary one evening as they watched their students walking home after class. "You've given them knowledge and hope for a better future." Mary's school gained a reputation throughout the county, and families from neighboring ranches would send their children to learn from her. She developed a lending library using the books Robert's mother had collected, and she ordered new books whenever they could afford them. As the years passed, Mary and Robert's family grew. They had 3 more children together, 2 boys and another girl. Grace grew up thinking she was the luckiest girl in the world to have such a loving papa and such wonderful brothers and sisters. The ranch prospered under Robert's management, but more importantly, it became known as a place where people were treated fairly and with dignity. Mary's influence made Robert an even better leader, and together they created a community where everyone felt valued and respected. One evening, about 10 years after their wedding, Mary and Robert sat on the porch of their ranch house, watching their children play in the yard. Grace, now a confident young girl, was teaching her younger siblings how to read using the same patient methods her mother had taught her. "Do you ever think about that day when I found you on the road?" Robert asked, taking Mary's hand in his. Mary smiled and squeezed his hand. "Every day," she said. "I think about how desperate and scared I was, pulling that old wagon and wondering how I was ever going to survive. I never could have imagined that the worst day of my life would lead to the best thing that ever happened to me." "I think about it too," Robert said. I was just a lonely man going through the motions of living, thinking I had everything I needed. I had no idea that everything I really needed was walking down a dusty road, pulling a broken-down wagon and carrying a miracle. As the sun set over their ranch, painting the sky in brilliant shades of orange and pink, Mary reflected on the journey that had brought her to this moment. From abandonment and despair to love and fulfillment, her life had taken a turn she never could have predicted. And it all started with one act of kindness from a stranger who became the love of her life.